Welcome to Standards Over Time, an all-new tool based in iWalkObservation version 11.2. Standards Over Time is an iWalkObservation tool aimed at focusing on teacher standards, evaluation standards, and evaluation rubrics, allowing you as the user to capture narrative notes on individual teacher standards. Let's take a look at the tool. Before you'll actually be able to use the tool, you're going to need to select a teacher. And once you do, the entire tool will be available. Now, before we actually talk more about how to configure this tool, let's first do a walkthrough as if I'm actually observing a classroom teacher. One thing to know about my tool set is that I've already filled it with teacher standards specific to my school district. And we're going to talk about how to do that in just a moment. But first, we've selected our teacher, and now let's begin to capture narrative notes. The idea behind Standards Over Time is that you're capturing individual, isolated observations. These observations are going to be used to evaluate certain teacher standards that you and your school district may have. Now, in this narrative observation, I've captured that as I entered the classroom, the students were well engaged. Teacher has provided detailed questions for them to talk about in small groups. And then once I've done that, I would select a standard that would correspond with. Now remember, I've already pre-populated my school district standards into this copy of Standards Over Time. And you'll want to do that for yourself before you use the tool. Now, for my school, Domain 2, or these 2A, 2B, 2C, these are all standards, teacher evaluation standards that represent classroom management, classroom planning. In Section 3, again within my school district, these are more towards the learning, the instruction, and the grouping. And so for this narrative note, I'm going to pick instructional grouping. And you'll notice that as soon as I do, the full standard or any full description has appeared below. Once I've done that, I want to post this to the timeline. And by clicking Post, that entry is going to go into this accumulative timeline that you'll see below. What's important to understand with Standards Over Time is that it's going to collect these notes over time, not just for today's visit, but for any visit that I walk into this classroom and use the Standards Over Time tool. Those individual observations will be collected here. Now, another way to think about Standards Over Time is that you walk into the classroom and you capture your narrative note. Now you'll see, of course, in this narrative observation, I've captured that a student was being disruptive, that the teacher had to redirect the student 3 times, and on that 3rd time walked over to the student and asked the student if they could help directly. Now, of course, again, I'm going to select the standard that this is going to correspond to. Maybe it's behavioral expectations or monitoring behavior, and I'm going to record that to my timeline. But very often when I'm doing observations, it's quick fire. I simply want to grab and capture an observation and add it to my timeline, coming back to it at a later date. And that's something that's very possible with Standards Over Time. So I simply have written my narrative observation and boom, I'm going to hit Post to Timeline. You'll note now that it posted it, but it's missing that standard. And I can come back to that at another time. So perhaps I have another observation that I've captured, and again, I simply click to post it to the timeline. Later in the day, perhaps I'm back in my office and I want to give my observations more thought. I can click on Observation and find that observation that I just completed in Ann Sullivan's classroom. And I can see that here are all of these standards over time that I still need to complete or finish writing my notes. By clicking on it, I will have access to that note, and it's going to ask me if I want to unlock that posted observation, and the answer, of course, is yes. Now that I've got some more time to reflect on this, I want to take a look and assign that standard. By doing it, fills in, of course, the full standard description, and I post it back to the timeline. You'll notice that it doesn't enter in as an additional timeline entry, but rather updates the existing one. And here's the other one that just simply said another observation note, and perhaps I want to change that, add a couple paragraphs or correct some spelling, and again find the standard that it applies to. and posted back to the timeline. Now, of course, Standards Over Time is equipped with a number of different reminders so that if you forget to post it to the timeline, it will remind you to do so before you try to exit this screen. Now let's take a look at how to configure Standards Over Time. We're going to do that by going to the Config button of Standards once I'm inside the tool. Of course, I can get to this configuration screen by also going through the main menu, the Configure button, and then Standards Over Time. So Standards Over Time configuration screen is quite simple. I have my email introduction, as I would with any of my iWalkObservation tools, and below that I have a table of all of the different standards that I'm currently using. These standards are going to alphabetize by alphabet or by number according to how you set the standard abbreviation name. It's very simple to add. Click on our Add button, and we're going to get a dialog box that allows us to add the standard abbreviation or name, and then to add a standard in full. So perhaps I have a standard that is called 1B behavior, and I would give the full description of the standard on behavior in this field. When I do that, we're going to see that my standard has been added to my table list. I can go in and edit this at any time, and I can see all of the other standards that I am currently using. If your school district uses a evaluation rubric, perhaps one that is similar to a rubric such as Danielson or Kim Marshall, or perhaps even Marzano's work, your standard or your abbreviated standard would simply be abbreviated name of the standard that you're looking for, and then the full description of that standard. Once we go back to the tool, we of course are going to see that under the select the observable standard is going to be right there available for you, and that's of course the one I just entered. Now same if I've made an error for a standard and want to correct it, I can go back in to my Standards Over Time to do that. Here's that standard that I just demonstrated for you, and I'm just simply going to delete it from my database. It does allow me to preview what it will look like when I send it to my teacher. Because Standards Over Time is really collecting a number of mini observations over a very specific period of time, I'm also able to send a range of information to my teachers and of course to myself. I can send the most recent visit, in which it's going to send the last time you visited in the classroom and all of the observations made for that day. Or I can also ask it to send the past 7 days of observation notes that I've taken in this tool. Perhaps I'd like to capture all of my narrative notes for the past 2 weeks, or simply all standard-based observations that I've written. In the preview, we see the script that's going to be sent by email. We see who, of course, the email is sent to. That's both the teacher and to me. And the dates of each individual standard observation over time that I have taken, the standard that was observed, as well as the narrative comments that were made. If I press send, the same dialog box is going to come up asking me to pick my observation range. Again, Standards Over Time is a little different than other tools. This tool captures mini observations based off of teacher standards, and those standards are accumulated over a period of time. So I get to choose if I'm going to send the most recent visit observations, the past week, past 2 weeks, or all standard-based observations that I've made for this teacher in this period of time. If we go back to the main menu, just as a reminder, our reports is a great tool for us to use when it's time to evaluate a teacher that we have observed over the past 3, 6, or 12 months. The report will allow us to select the teacher and then select what it is we want to include in the report. Of course, Standards Over Time will be included in these summary reports. Please visit support.iWalkObservation.com for more support information, and demos and documentations for every tool in iWalkObservation, or email me with questions and comments at kevinc@iWalkObservation.com.